So welcome to the letter writing workshop today, September 26th, our day of service for 2020. With us today, we have David Gist. He's the senior organizer for the state of California, representing Bread for the World. And today he will lead us on to this one session where we all can take action through letter writing. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thank you for having me as part of your day of learning. I'm excited because I'm not going to spend a lot of time sharing about who exactly Bread for the World is. I've done that a number of times in the past, but I do want to give us some time to have a really interesting exercise that we can do together. So to do that, I'm going to actually go right ahead and share my screen. So bear with me as I start sharing the screen, and let's see if this is going to work right. I trust everyone can see the screen all right. This is it says the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. At Bread for the World, is our network of churches and parishes and priests and leaders and sisters is trying to end hunger, we're increasingly realizing that we cannot end hunger without thinking about racial equity. And so someone, well, I'll get to how this is created a little bit later, but we have this exercise, the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. And that's what I'd like to do with you today, where we're gonna go through a simulation together. And I just want to say thank you for everyone for making time for this today. I think coming into this, we probably all have questions about race, about questions about injustice, questions about disparity, about the conversations in our parishes, in our houses of worship, in our communities, in our streets that are going on. And I hope that this exercise can shine a light on some of those conversations and be instructive for us. Now, because Bread for the World is preoccupied with ending hunger and helping people lift themselves out of poverty and hardship, a natural starting point for this exercise is to take a quick look at hunger and poverty here in this country. So before COVID-19 came, before we had the pandemic, we already had quite a few people in this country facing hunger on a daily basis, about almost the same number of people living below the poverty line. And about half of American households would face poverty if someone simply lost their job or got ill for a long enough period of time. Now, those were statistics before COVID-19. So we know that, of course, now it's even worse. And in this era of healthcare conversations, we hear a lot about the phrase pre-existing condition. And now we're hearing about it in a COVID-19 context, pre-existing condition. But I would suggest that race in this country is a pre-existing condition that affects hunger and poverty and public health. And people of color are more likely to face experiencing hunger, living below the poverty line, being one paycheck away from being poor. They're more likely to face that than Caucasian Americans, than white Americans. And so why is that? So the question is why? And I think one answer is because there is a racial wealth and income divide in this country. And that's what we're going to explore in this exercise. It's an exercise to educate ourselves, to get a more detail of some of this information and a greater broad understanding of it. It's not an exercise to induce guilt or bad feelings. It's just really to learn. And I hope that, like I say, it can shed some light on other kinds of questions that people have. For example, what would create that kind of gap? What creates a racial wealth gap? So we're going to look at that in detail. And of course, people talk about financial reparations, based on slavery and the history of slavery in this country, or race history since slavery. What are they talking about? How would you even identify and quantify damage for financial reparations? Well, I think this exercise will identify and quantify damage. And so that's an illustration for how maybe even reparations could look. And a final question, I think we've all heard that phrase, and perhaps we've all even used the phrase, the system is broken. You know, sometimes we talk about our justice system or criminal justice system is broken, or immigration system is broken, or something's not working the way it should in society. And I want to question that and say, are these systems broken, or are these systems working exactly as they were designed? And when it comes to racial wealth gap, let's keep that in mind, that maybe things are working just how they were designed. So before we begin this exercise, I want to introduce the person who created it, and that is the photo there in the corner, Marlisa Gamblin. She's a young woman from California and who works in Washington, D.C. for Bread for the World Institute. And she and her friends at the Catholic Organization Network designed the racial wealth gap learning simulation together to examine the racial wealth gap between specifically African Americans and Caucasian Americans as an illustration of one specific racial wealth gap. And I want to say something about that, because Marlisa is Californian. She's a native Californian, and she loves and cherishes the rich diversity of this state. And in California, we have people from so many different backgrounds. There are many First Nations peoples here, First Peoples, many indigenous nations in California. There are many immigrant groups from all over the world in different collective communities around California. There are Latino and Latina leaders and communities from so many parts of Latin America, but here in California for many generations. There are African Americans from different locations in California. There are people of so many rich backgrounds. So I don't want to suggest that this exercise is trying to look at that range and breadth of diversity. In fact, it is not. It's really looking at this one specific gap between African American and Caucasian American. And it's an academic study. And Marlisa is an academic. She got her master's degree at Harvard University. She's very thorough and exhaustive in her research. And so you may have questions that come up as this exercise goes along. I may or may not be able to answer them. Marlisa could answer them. She's brilliant and well researched. And she has a lot of the answers on our website. So you can actually go to our website with follow-up questions and learn more. Also want to say something about this exercise, because it's called the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. So it's a simulation, I call it an exercise. The word I'm trying not to use is the G word. I'm trying not to call it a game. If we were meeting in person, the way I used to facilitate these when we were not, before COVID, before the pandemic, we would all be in one room together, and we would sit at different tables, maybe 8 people to a table. And we would assign ourselves race participant cards. And so half of us at the table would receive white race participant cards, and half of us would receive black race participant cards. And we would either do that randomly, or we would just ask, what do you want to be assigned for the purpose of this exercise? But along the course of the exercise, we would go to 13 different points in this exercise where we draw more cards. So it feels a little bit like a game, like we're in Monopoly and we're drawing chance cards or something else cards. It's a little bit like that, but I try not to say a game, because a game involves strategy and competition, winning and losing, and that's not part of this exercise. Instead of strategy, I would say there's clear intention by those who created all these laws and policies, but I don't think there's a strategy for us in how we're playing it. The power of this exercise is in the journey itself, in what we learn and what we take away, and hopefully what we're inspired to do in response. So I invite you, instead of thinking of this as a game, to think of it as a reckoning. So now we're ready to begin, but I need everyone to assign themselves either a black or white race participant card for the sake of this exercise. So can everyone do that? Just to take this moment and say, I'm gonna, for this learning opportunity. I'm going to be in the role of a white participant or a black participant. So just choose one and stick with that. And then we'll do that. We'll reference that throughout the exercise. Basically, we're going to visit 13 moments in US history, 13 policy moments. And as a result of the consequences of those policies and those moments in history, as white participants, we're going to gather certain cards, money, land, and opportunity lost. As black participants, we're going to accumulate some of those cards as well, money, land, and opportunity lost. And you could keep score if you wanted to have a piece of paper out, and say, I'm in the role of a black participant and I have this many cards of these 3 categories. But you don't need to do that, because I'm going to have an interactive sheet, a sheet on the screen that will keep tabs, and that'll be kind of a scorecard or a reckoning. So that was a mouthful. Let me just check really quickly. Are there any questions right now before we begin, or can we jump in and get going? So the first few policies where we're going to pick up in this exercise begin after the Civil War. And that's a very interesting time in US history, because the Civil War has come to an end. Great death and trauma in the nation. There's been the emancipation of slavery, and yet, of course, relations between Black Americans and white Americans at that time, very, very volatile and tense, obviously, particularly in the South, in this period of Reconstruction, and certainly former slave owners took many steps to try to influence government and policy to favor themselves and to discriminate against former slaves and people who are now Black Americans and citizens. So, Yesenia, would you be so kind as to read this first policy number 1 card for everyone?
Of course. We have Andrew Johnson's land policies and sharecropping. After the Civil War, only 30,000 African Americans owned small plots of land, compared to 4 million who did not, because of the 1865 federal law, rescinded the government's promise of 40 acres of land for former slaves. These 4 million Black people largely resorted to renting to the farmlands of their previous masters in exchange for a share of their crop. This system of sharecropping tied farmers to their former masters because they were legally obligated to buy all farming materials, usually at higher prices, and then sell their farming crops solely to their former masters, usually at lower prices.
Thank you. Wow. Well, that's pretty loaded, isn't it? So that the former slaves who have been emancipated are trying to establish farms and do farming, but the sharecropping system is part of land policy right then, so that of course their former slaves are basically relying upon their former masters in terms of where they're buying their materials at inflated prices, selling crops at lower prices. So you can see the system is rigged here. And as a result of that, so those of us who have decided to be in the role for this exercise of Black participants, please pick up 1 land card and 1 money card to represent the less than 1% of African Americans who were able to own land and not face debt after slavery. Unfortunately, Black participants should also pick up 4 lost opportunity cards for the 4 million African Americans who had to sharecrop and were denied the initial promise of land ownership. Buying farm supplies from the landowner at higher prices, only to sell their crops back at lower prices, resulted in African Americans facing higher levels of debt and higher rates of hunger. So this is what our scorecard looks like just after the first policy. Maria Elena, would you care to read the second policy for us?
Yes, of course. Policy number 2, land seizures. From 1865 on, Black people could have their lands seized to pay sharecropping debts, or simply because white landowners declared that Black farmers or businesses were in debt. Black people could not fight these charges because they were legally prohibited from suing white people in court. In addition, from 1949 to 1970, 1 million people lost their land to abuses of power of eminent domain, which allows local governments to seize private property. About 70% of these families were African American.
And this is notable, again, so this was not, land seizures were not exclusively directed at African Americans, but about 70% of the families who lost land to eminent domain were African American. And that's a considerable amount. So it's not exclusive, that's important to note. But you can see that would have an effect on a cumulative racial wealth gap. So as a consequence of this policy, white participants pick up 1 land card and 2 money cards for having the legal ability to seize the land of Black farmers and business owners, increasing your income and reducing your vulnerability to hunger. Black participants return a land card for the land lost under land seizures, also return a money card for the tens of millions of dollars lost from no longer having land to help earn an income and grow food to eat. And here is here are our scorecard or scoreboard and reckoning after 2 policies. Yesenia?
The National Housing Act of 1934. Policies under this law guaranteed federally backed loans to white people and legally refused loans to Black people and anyone else who chose to live in or near Black neighborhoods. This practice, known as redlining, targeted entire Black neighborhoods and identified them as Grade D. This made it nearly impossible for appraisers in the private sector to do business in Black neighborhoods because all the residents were considered bad credit risks.
This is another interesting moment. The first 2 policies were after the Civil War, great national trauma, country's rebuilding, and now the next few policies come after the Great Depression and during the New Deal, when FDR has been elected president and FDR and the Congress are working urgently to try to rebuild the United States. A worldwide depression, but very acutely felt in the US, the Great Depression. And so yet again, the nation's rebuilding after a great trauma, after great hardship and loss, and yet not everyone seems to be included in that rebuild. And that's very, very disappointing and disheartening. As a consequence of this National Housing Act, white participants pick up 1 land card and 1 money card for the equity gained in purchasing homes not near Black neighborhoods. Equity increased a family's ability to save for future needs. And of course, home equity is a huge part of creating equity for passing down for generations. Black participants do not pick up any land cards because of the inability to purchase homes, do not pick up any money cards since it was illegal to lend to Black people, preventing them from building equity and weakening their ability to save for future needs. So here is our scorecard after 3 policies. And here are a few links because redlining often prompts questions. And so I've got 2 articles here, links to 2 articles that might be interesting for you to see and to read and just get a little more background about how redlining worked in the time it was functioning, particularly following in the New Deal era, but then how redlining continues in certain ways today. And these links you may be able to access just by having a copy of this PowerPoint, but I have also sent these links in an email to Maria Elena and Yesenia, so we have those links to make available to you. Let's see, Maria Elena, you want to read the 4th?
Yes. The National Housing Act of 1934, Part 2. Since this legislation prevented Black people from receiving federally backed home mortgages, white people usually purchased homes in Black neighborhoods and then sold housing contracts to Black households who wanted to become homeowners, often for 2 or 3 times the amount of the mortgage. These contracts only guaranteed Black families the rights to the house after all the payments were complete. Missing even one payment or being late would result in the Black family losing their house immediately.
Wow. That last line really stays with me. Missing even one payment or being late results in the Black family losing their house immediately. So that certainly took place. And as a result, as a consequence of this policy, white participants pick up 2 land cards for being able to legally purchase homes at the market rate and pick up 2 money cards for the equity earned from home ownership. Black participants pick up 1 land card for signing a contract for a home in hopes of becoming a homeowner one day. Do not pick up any money cards because contracts stripped additional income and wealth from several generations. Also, pick up 1 lost opportunity card because of the higher interest paid and less equity earned once the home was actually purchased. And here's our scorecard after 4 policies. Now, let's take a moment here to just pause and chat a bit. So I'm wondering what you all have learned in those first 4 policies that you didn't know before. Wondering how you feel about your race participant role. And also, just if there are any questions that are pending from the first few policy points. So, there we go. And Yusani, would you be so kind as to read policy 5?
Yes, policy 5, the Social Security Act of 1935. This act excluded farm workers and domestic workers, who at this time were predominantly Black, from receiving old age and unemployment insurance. Although Social Security was meant to help those affected by the Great Depression, and African Americans were twice as likely as the average American family to face hunger during this time, 65% of African Americans were ineligible to receive Social Security.
And there is another important pillar of the New Deal, of the country rebuilding after the National Depression, the Social Security Act. Social Security is something that people rely on and talk about and count on today. And yet we see that when it was created, a lot of people were left out. Not exclusively African Americans, but more often African Americans. And I suspect if we examine this more broadly, people of color, of different races. So that's, again, another disappointing lesson and moment. As a result of this, as a consequence of this policy, white participants pick up 1 money card for being able to benefit from unemployment and old age insurance during a very grim time in American history. Black participants pick up 1 lost opportunity card for their inability to benefit from unemployment insurance, even though African Americans were between 2 and 3 times as likely as white Americans to experience poverty and hunger. And here's our scorecard following 5 policies. Maria Elena, would you be so kind as to read this one?
Yes. Policy number 6, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which created minimum wage and time and a half overtime pay and prohibits oppressive child labor. This law enacted to help bolster the economy and get the country out of the Great Depression, but it excluded tip-based jobs and other jobs predominantly held by Black workers, including servers, shoe shiners, domestic workers, and pullman porters. for this first ever minimum wage legislation. Even though the Black unemployment, hunger, and poverty rates were at least twice of white people during the Great Depression, the very policies meant to alleviate economic strain were withheld from Black community.
So here it is, I mean, more landmark legislation, you know, creating a minimum wage, wow, and overtime pay, but it ended up excluding a lot of types of jobs. Now, Pullman porters, that's a really interesting profession historically. I've seen a couple of documentary films and pieces made about Pullman porters, and those are the porters who are on trains running across the country and were largely African-American male Pullman porters. So it was a very common job for Black men to go into. And those jobs that were, you know, tip-based or you know, were largely tip-based, you know, weren't getting help from this minimum wage legislation. So that's, anyway, that's another area where there are consequences. So the consequences in this exercise are that white participants pick up one money card for benefiting from the minimum wage to make their families less vulnerable to hunger and poverty. Black participants pick up one lost opportunity card for being stuck in tip-based occupations that did not offer a minimum wage to help families survive during the Great Depression. This made it even harder for them to get back on their feet and build for the future. And you know, you might think a little bit about today's economy. People refer in 2020 to the gig economy, you know, where people are inviting other people to stay in their homes through Airbnb or delivering food through various food delivery services or ushering people around in their cars through Uber or Lyft or one of the other services. So there's kind of a gig economy that has grown today, but I suspect some of those people do not have certain benefits and do not have tips and other kinds of things that are as great that come into play when it comes to accumulating wealth. So here's the scorecard after 6 policies, and the trend is already pretty clear in terms of white participants amassing money and land, and Black participants largely amassing opportunities that are lost. Yesenia, would you be so kind with policy 7?
Yes. Policy 7, the GI Bill of 1944.
What the heck?
This was enacted to help World War II veterans adjust to civilian life by providing low-cost home mortgages, low-interest business loans, tuition assistance, and unemployment insurance. Unfortunately, Black veterans were excluded from many of these benefits.
Now, this is one of the ones that shocked me the first time I did this exercise, because the GI Bill is huge in kind of mid 20th century history for the U.S. So many families, so many veterans came out of the war and as beneficiaries of the GI Bill, you know, were able to go to school and buy homes and start businesses. And it just was a huge platform from which people and families thrived. And this is not suggesting that no Black veterans were benefited, no, but what has happened is that it came down to access. The bill was written in a way that it made it harder for African Americans to access the GI Bill. And I have some links about that, because we're going to say, how, what do they do? It's, you know, the details, the devil's in the details. And so I've got some links for you to read articles if you're interested in getting follow-up information. But the consequences of this policy are that white participants pick up 2 money cards and 1 land card for the opportunities you've received, such as government guaranteed housing loans. That's great, which helped to build the American middle class, or at least part of it. Black participants in your group only, so this speaks to when we were usually at a table together and say there were 8 of us at one table and 4 people had chosen to be Black participants in that role. And so of those 4 participants, only 1 Black participant would pick up a money card, representing the few African Americans who actually had access to some benefits of the GI Bill. All Black, all 4 at the table would pick up 1 lost opportunity card for not being able to benefit from the GI Bill, even though they too had fought for the United States in World War II. So I think we could actually call this bit of history shameful. And the consequences lead to this reckoning on the scorecard. So again, because we often have questions about the access, I've got these links for you to just look at, and that might answer questions far better than I can, and greater brevity than say talking with Marlisa or going to our website, because I think these articles get right to it. But Maria Elena, would you be so kind with policy 8?
Yes. Policy number 8, Overturn of Separate but Equal doctrine, which upheld legal racial segregation. Although the separate but equal doctrine was declared unconstitutional in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, American schools are more racially segregated today than at any time in the past 4 decades. Academic success is less likely in predominantly low-income Black neighborhoods. Black students are 5 times as likely to live in an area of concentrated poverty with underfunded, understaffed, and overcrowded schools. This leaves Black students with limited education, and many often settle for minimum wage jobs that offer little hope to advance or better pay.
The consequences of this education policy, white participants pick up 2 money cards for having up to $733 higher annual per student spending on education than Black students. This contributes to a greater likelihood of attending college and later getting a higher paid job. Black participants pick up only 1 money card to represent the 75% high school graduation rate among Black students, compared to 88% among white students. Also pick up 1 lost opportunity card for the lower student spending that helps funnel many Black students into low-wage work after high school. And here we have the scoreboard and our reckoning after 8 policies. So let me ask again, if we just take a moment, we don't have to take too long, but just take a moment and see if there are things that people learned in the last few policies that they didn't know, or if you're inspired to think, wow, what needs to change to create greater racial equity where there has been inequity. At our 9th policy, and Yesenia, if you would be so kind to read us this 9th one, which we already started talking about, subprime loans.
Subprime loans. Starting in the 1970s and continuing today, the private sector issued subprime loans, which are loans with higher interest rates, to Black families almost exclusively, regardless of families' income, education, or good credit history. As a result, Black people continue to unfairly pay more for homes of the same value as their white counterparts. This increases foreclosure rates among Black households, which also contributes to higher food insecurity levels.
As a consequence of subprime loans, white participants pick up 2 land cards and 2 money cards for securing good interest rates on homes. Black homeowners were forced into subprime mortgages as their only option for more than 3 generations, stripping income and wealth from the Black community. High-income Black households were 80% more likely to lose their homes than high-income white households when the housing bubble burst in 2008, and 240,000 Black people lost their homes in the US. Therefore, Black participants pick up only one land card and one money card. Here's the scorecard and reckoning after 9 policies. And here are a couple of articles on subprime loans that people might find interesting. The first article just highlights the racial bias that was there historically. And the second article looks at a Black majority county in, I think, the state of Virginia. It might be Maryland, either Maryland or Virginia, and looks at how subprime lending has affected that county. Marilena, would you be so kind as to read policy 10?
Yes, first. Policy number 10, the war on drugs. The war on drugs, initiated in 1971 and continuing today, widened the racial wealth gap with policies targeting Black and Brown communities. Although rates of using and selling drugs are comparable across racial lines, Black people are up to 10 times as likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, persecuted, convicted, and/or incarcerated for drug violations as white people. Since this means that Black families are up to 10 times as likely to have a family member sent to prison, they are more than 10 times as likely to fall into hunger because of incarceration.
And here's another example of one of those policies where we think, is the system broken, or is the system working, the way it seems to be designed? And certainly with people of color in this country being overly policed, and racial profiling going on in who was pulled over and searched or examined or questioned, and we see the clear, mountains of evidence of how people of African Americans and Latina Americans and white Americans all get very different sentencing rates for the very same crime. So they get, white people are sentenced or receive far lighter sentences for the same crimes. And that's just, again, there's just too much evidence to argue against that. So we see some of the costs of the war on drugs. Consequence would be that white participants return 2 money cards for the more than $180 billion in tax dollars that it costs to maintain mass incarceration today. Also pick up 1 lost opportunity card, since these taxpayer dollars could instead be used to support programs that end hunger and poverty in the United States. That's, of course, how we think at Bread for the World. These dollars could be used to support any number of good programs that invest in communities, as well as ending hunger and poverty. Black participants combined debt and property depreciation increased hunger and poverty rates within the Black community. Return 2 money cards would be more likely to be incarcerated than white people, and owing debts of about $13,000 per household in fees and court costs when a family member is incarcerated. Return 1 land card for the estimated $11 billion in lower property values in many African American communities caused by the return of large numbers of people from jail or prison. And this is a notable point in this exercise because, of course, we haven't had white participants returning money cards and picking up lost opportunity cards at other moments. But this policy of the war on drugs has really proven costly to really every sector of society. And so here's our scoreboard after 10 policies. Yesenia, would you be so kind with policy 11?
Life after incarceration. The consequences of the war on drugs. When people are released from jail or prison, they're hoping for a second chance. But they face more than 48,000 separate restrictions that deny rights and opportunities to people who have paid their debt to society. Examples of lifelong penalties include being denied to the right to vote in some states, being prohibited from applying to higher paying jobs, being ineligible to receive federal food assistance, and being banned from getting a barber's license. Since Black people are up to 10 times as likely as white people to be stopped, arrested, and sentenced, they are also up to 10 times as likely to face these restrictions.
Now, thank you. Now, happily in California, these restrictions are less stringent than in other states. In California, people leaving prison can receive federal food assistance, and they can vote. So former felons can vote, and there are fewer restrictions, but there still are some. And they're simply, when you have a restriction that prevents you from getting a job, that prevents you from getting a license to become a barber or a license to do so many other professions, you know, it just narrows options and possibilities. And the funny thing is that everyone wants people leaving prison to succeed. It's in everyone's interest in society that people who are leaving prison or jail, you know, succeed in a second chance, that they're able to find work and honest work, that they're able to secure food, that they can get health care. If people who are in positions of needing to go through rehab are able to go through rehab, those are all important services. And I'm blessed because I live a little north of most of you, or some of you, in Pasadena, where in Pasadena and Altadena, we have a wonderful network here that receives people leaving jail and prison and helps try to connect them with social services, connect them with job training, connect them with opportunities, connect them with rehab if that's what's needed, connect them with mentors, connect them with so many different kinds of service and help so that they will succeed stepping back into life after having served time. But what's interesting in Pasadena and Altadena is that law enforcement is part of that network. And I'm not making a comment about law enforcement and the dissent we have on the streets right now. I'll just say that in Pasadena and Altadena, the law enforcement community is pretty excited about this reentry program, and they want people coming out of prison to succeed, and they want this program to succeed, and so they support it. And I'd like to see that more. I'd love to see more parts, more places and more cities where people are working together more broadly to help people succeed leaving prison. And that's something we're gonna have some letters to write about later, or very soon actually. So as a consequence of policy 11, Black participants, there are 5 times as many Black people as white people returning home with criminal records. Pick up 2 lost opportunity cards to represent how Black communities are more likely to fall into hunger because so many returnees are unable to reintegrate into society, get a job, and or access federal and state food assistance. And after 11, here is our scoreboard. We just have 2 more policies, so we're almost to the end of this. Maria Elena, would you be so kind as to read policy 12?
Yes, policy 12 on employment discrimination. Although racial discrimination in the workforce was legally abolished in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, racial discrimination continues among all educational levels and job sectors. For example, Black people are twice as likely not to be called back after they complete a job application or interviews. In addition, the gap between hourly pay of Black people and white people grew from $3.55 an hour in 1970 to $6.73 an hour in 2016.
Wow. So the consequence that Marlisa has established for this exercise of employment discrimination, white participants pick up 2 money cards for being twice as likely to receive a callback for a job and for earning an average of $14,000 a year more than your Black peers. Black participants pick up 2 lost opportunity cards for being 2 times less likely to receive a job callback and for earning an average of $14,000 a year less than your white peers. Doing the math shows that racial discrimination in the workforce costs Black workers at least $600,000 over the course of their working years. And there again, we can point to a tangible example of a racial wealth gap. And here's the scorecard after the first 12 policies, so it's pretty one-sided. Why don't I just finish this up? The 13th policy is on voting restrictions. And certainly voting is key to ending hunger and poverty. I think someone earlier in this exercise pointed out that who is in office. You know, if you mostly had white men in Congress, then their interests were more likely to be represented. So as early as 1890, Black people faced organized campaigns to prevent them from voting, including biased literacy tests, poll taxes, and even lynching. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, making efforts to prevent voting illegal. But today, people returning from jail or prison who are disproportionately Black are denied the right to vote in many states. Florida is a very notable example right now, and that's gotten a lot of attention in the news. In addition, as recently as 2017, states have proposed voter ID laws, which would require voters to have government-issued identification. It is more difficult for African Americans to obtain these. 1 in 4 face barriers compared with 1 in 10 white people. Barriers include, for example, having to pay up to $150 for an acceptable copy of a birth certificate and social security card, travel costs, and time taken off from work. So as a result of this final policy, number 13, Black participants pick up one lost opportunity card for one, being prevented from voting in the early 1900s when the votes of Black people might have prevented some of the harmful laws mentioned in the simulation from being enacted. And I think, again, someone made that point very well earlier. And number 2, still facing voting restrictions that disproportionately impact Black communities and weaken efforts to improve policies that end hunger and poverty. On the screen now, got an interesting timeline, kind of a snake chart, or a chart that snakes around, but you can see those early policies coming right after the Civil War, and then more coming in the New Deal following the Depression, and then post-World War II, as the country is in another level of rebuilding, and then some of the things that were taking place in the 1970s onward with the war on drugs and things that were happening with subprime loans. You perhaps have seen documentary films and film footage of groups that expose some of the things that were going on in real estate, where, for instance, a Black couple would go into a real estate office and told, no, there was nothing in this neighborhood, nothing available. And then a white couple would follow later, a few minutes later, and then be shown properties that had not been shown to the Black couple. So we know that kind of thing was being exposed, but it's a different matter to actually try to deal with it in policy and law and to change that. So when we think about the money cards we ended up with, I think it was 13 money cards for the white participants, and 14 opportunity lost cards for Black participants. But this is our final standings, our final reckoning. And as I say, it's definitely one-sided. Marlisa did a little bit more research just to break this down another way, to show that the median net worth is about a 13-to-1 ratio between white households and Black households. And then for households that are living near the poverty line, it's even more extreme. So we have an 18,000 to 0 ratio. So it just reminds us how Black households living near the poverty line are exceptionally vulnerable. So some of the takeaways, I hope we can understand why racial equity is so important to address structural inequality, and that we can think about how to apply a racial equity lens into what we're doing. We certainly think about that at Bread for the World, and to be equipped to advocate for applying a racial equity lens in all we're doing with policy. But I want to just point to a couple of examples of that. There are parts of the city where where neighborhoods of mostly people of color are living in areas of environmental degradation. And those have been there for a long time and historically, and I think there are racist reasons why certain neighborhoods get targeted for pollution, and other neighborhoods are protected more from pollution. I think we can see a connection between environmental degradation and racism. A second area is the impact of COVID. You know, it's been widely reported how people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 for a lot of public health reasons, but also reasons related to this exercise of wealth and affluence. And then a third thing I want to point to, that the blue on the screen, the government response to COVID. You know, you think it's 2020 and we wouldn't be making some of these same mistakes, and yet after one of the early responses of pandemic relief from the US Congress, it came out that a lot of Black businesses were not helped by some of that early relief. White businesses were, but not Black businesses. And it turns out that a lot of Black businesses were working with different banks and credit unions and brokers than the white businesses were. And the banks and businesses and credit brokers that were helped more by Congress were the ones that were working with white businesses. So it's just a reminder that we absolutely have to be vigilant in telling our government they have to think with a racial equity lens and apply that lens to what's going on if they really want to help address people who are hurting. Now, an interesting thought there is that, well, could the Federal Reserve ever get involved? And so here's another link to an article. I won't get into it now, but just to see if the Federal Reserve ever decides to think in those terms and proactively prescribe policy that would, using a racial equity lens. And this takes us to the point where we actually have a couple of opportunities to be in touch with elected leaders. So here's the first one, and I'm gonna go through these slides, and then I'm gonna give you the copy of the slide of the PowerPoint, and also give you links that'll help you do some of these things. So, and I've sent that all in email already to Yesenia and Maria Elena. So basically, there's a bill this year that we're really excited about in this California state legislature. It was in the Assembly originally, so it's Assembly Bill 3073. And basically, it's so simple. It's working with people who are in prison, incarcerated, but are also eligible because of income to get, you know, food stamps, SNAP, CalFresh. And the idea is they're in prison, and they're already filling out different forms in prison. If they just check one more box, if you add one more box to the form and they're eligible and they check that box, then when they leave prison, they can immediately access food assistance, CalFresh, for themselves and their families as soon as they get out, rather than we wait weeks and weeks and weeks and maybe even months as other things are distracting them, as the wheels are turning too slowly in the bureaucracy. So this bill, we've been pushing it all year through the California Assembly. The Assembly passed it, the Senate passed it, the whole legislature passed it and sent it to Governor Newsom, and he has not signed it yet. I recognize he's a busy guy. We've got all these fires or things are distracting him, but we need him to sign this bill. I mean, it's essentially unanimously supported by the Assembly and the Senate. So it has no big worries. And if you use the link that's on the screen here to contact the governor, you'd simply go to that link, and then in the subject line, you scroll down and find AB 3073, and you click that so they know what you're writing about. And you can click positive, I think there's a box that says you're in favor of it. And then you can just write whatever message you want in the open box. And here's a screen where I've got a few different talking points. We've got a talking point that relates to just why it matters if we're trying to end hunger. Or there's a talking point about fiscal sense, about how it's really sensible to do this, to invest in people when they need it, rather than dealing with the after effects later. Or a talking point on racial justice, about how people of color are overrepresented in prison and jail, and this food assistance can help communities of color disproportionately affected. And then finally, on public safety. I mean, a lot of people are coming out of prison and jail right now because of COVID-19, and this AB 3073 is going to reduce crime and recidivism and increase public safety because people would be, who are vulnerable would have food to eat. It's a no-brainer bill, and that's why it passed unanimously. It's a good bill. We just need the governor to sign that bill. So here's the message that I basically wrote to the governor. I just, told him, please sign AB 3073 into law now. I realize there's a lot happening in California to take up your attention, but the legislature passed this good bill with unanimous support with no budget concerns. And then I went on, we all benefit when people leaving prison and jail succeed in being part of society without committing another crime. So I go on, and that was my message to the governor. And again, you could use this message, use your own words, say what you want, but this will be available for you to send that email to the governor. Let me go back. So that's hopefully an action you can take either this weekend or in the week to come. Let's try to load up through the rest of the month with emails to the governor to get him to sign this bill. So that's our first writing action. Our second writing action is kind of interesting. We're trying to reach Senator Dianne Feinstein because Senator Dianne Feinstein is the ranking Democrat, which means she's the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C. Now, she has a good relationship with most people in that committee, and she's Republicans and Democrats, but this is not widely known, but there's something called the U.S. Sentencing Commission. It's required by law to be bipartisan, and this Sentencing Commission helps set prison terms every year. And that's just one of these federal agencies, bodies that is maintained year after year without problems until, of course, this president. And so our current president has not kept this body filled, has let people lapse and retire, and it's kept it unfilled. And then at the last moment, suddenly now, after leaving the Sentencing Commission understaffed, has decided to fill the U.S. Sentencing Commission with extremist judges. And that is not something that President Obama did, or President Bush did, or President Clinton did, or President Bush before him did, et cetera, et cetera. Other presidents have not been stacking the U.S. Sentencing Commission with extremists. There's a sense of this needing to be a body that's balanced. Of course, this president has decided to put hang 'em high Harry Hudson and other pretty extreme judges on to the Sentencing Commission, and we need the Judiciary Committee to stop that. We need them to not to approve extreme choices, but to approve reasonable choices, because these judges need to work together. So we have a phone number that you could write this down, or again, you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint. But if you just call 800-826-3688, that will take you to the Capitol switchboard, and you can ask to be transferred to Senator Dianne Feinstein's office, and they'll just transfer you right away. And then you just leave a message, and you just explain you're calling about the Judiciary Committee and the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and you really want the senator to please speak with Republican senators and Democratic senators on the Judiciary Committee, win their support to prevent extremist judges from being named to this Sentencing Commission. So that's our sample message there. And if you would rather email than make a phone call, well, then here is the email address for Senator Feinstein's legislative director, Josh Esquivel. And so there's a message that I've sent to Josh Esquivel, legislative director, making that same point. Now, technically, Senator Kamala Harris is also on the Judiciary Committee. So both Californian senators are on the committee. However, Senator Harris is a little distracted and busy right now, and bringing her into this might increase the partisan nature of it. And I think that's probably a bad tactic. So I think we're better off just speaking to Senator Feinstein and trying to win her support. Well, let me just see, are there any questions, comments at this point? Because really, I think we've come to the end of the exercise and the end of the actions, and it's really just more if there are other comments or questions about the exercise or about any of these actions. So, anyone?